Phoenix was, as always, with those two ridiculous priestesses that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Roger resisted the urge to let his lips curl, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. It was hard sometimes to maintain the farce in front of the fanatics, but he would have to conceal his disgust until later. After all, Edo could sense that. "We'll likely have to double the guard around the outer sanctuary and increase patrolling tonight. I don't think the riot today will be the end of it, and I won't see any believers seeking the temple being attacked or worse." Phoenix always had that disgusting spark of fervor in his eyes, the burning expression that made Roger want to throw up. In some aspects, it was almost amusing. The young man was so incredibly devout. It had been helpful in the past. Edo Phoenix preached with such zealous fervor that sometimes Roger himself was almost swayed into believing that the scrap of a boy locked in his chambers was actually a god from the heavens, sent to purge the world of impurities in preparation for the new world. A good chunk of Zarkanian's expansion had been due to Phoenix's preaching making converts out of a good many villages, so Roger supposed he shouldn't look the gift horse in the mouth. Other times, however, his fanaticism became annoying. Phoenix looked up as Roger approached, and the two priestesses he was speaking to paused, their own eyes moving almost as one to Roger. There was something eerie about them sometimes. They were twins, despite looking fairly distinct, and they seemed to move in sync without even trying. The younger sister was shorter than the other, her silver hair twisted into a traditional series of ponytails that rested on top of the rest of her hair, while the older sister's blonde hair had been pulled into a more practical high ponytail to keep it out of her face. They had the same slightly pinkish-toned skin and clear, pale eyes as Phoenix, all three of them Melians from southern Iwamaki. The Zarkanian religion had taken root there fairly prominently in the past decade, although the territory itself was not yet under the reign of the Empire. More bureaucracy that Roger would have to take care of. "Priest Phoenix," Roger said, trying to sound as smooth as possible. "Might I have a word?" "Of course. I thought I'd look for you myself in a moment," Phoenix said. He briefly turned to his priestesses, waving them off. "I'll trust your judgment, Priestess Grace, Priestess Gloria. You go with them too, Sora. If they should need to contact me, bring their messages to me, please." Roger had to bite back a swear as the tiny acolyte peeled himself out of the shadows. Roger hadn't even seen him there, and it took all he had not to snap at the boy. Phoenix's little message boy. Roger had never liked him. There was something too perceptive about his unblinking green eyes, about the way that he just stared at Roger without speaking any time they were in the same room. The boy simply nodded at Phoenix without a word, and then the two priestesses bowed, and all three turned back towards the hallway. Phoenix turned back to Roger then. "I'll expect you'll want to know the status of the riot," he said, tone clipped and professional. "We did contain the initial burst of violence without any casualties, but tensions are still high, and the rate of attacks on traveling priests in the capital seems to—" "I'm actually here to ask another question," Roger said, waving a hand with a smile. "Not that I don't want to hear your report, of course, but perhaps when you're ready to give something more stable." Phoenix hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded. "Thank you," he said. "What may I assist you with?" Roger cursed once again the events that had led to Edo Phoenix becoming the high priest of the Outer Sanctum. Roger had been pulling for one of his own to be elected to the position when the old priest died, but Phoenix had been far too popular among priests and believers alike. He was a bleeding heart and a zealot, and completely unaware of the truth about the boy. If he ever found out, it could become a disaster. Smooth, he had to remind himself, tamping down his emotions irritably. He can sense that. He faked a bland smile as he tried to get himself composed again, because if Edo Phoenix wasn't bad enough already, his blessing was that he was an empath. He could sense emotions, and Roger didn't need to make Edo suspicious. "You went off our script this morning," Roger said. I don't want to point fingers, but allowing the man to speak so ill of the Emperor, I don't think that helped this morning's tension. Phoenix's eyes dropped briefly. I apologize, he said, but it sounded like he was drawing out each word with difficulty. The Emperor, I sensed some distress from his grace. I thought perhaps he wanted to hear the man out. I see, Roger said, smiling as his hands tightened behind his back. Damn this bleeding heart empath. If Roger had the means, he would have the priest killed. Get him out of these affairs for good. And the boy felt distressed, Roger would have some things to say to that runt this evening. In the future, I would ask that you do your best to stick to what we prepare, Roger said. I do discuss these things with the Emperor beforehand. I understand, Phoenix said, bowing briefly. Please accept my apologies. Roger waved his hand noncommittally, smiling as blandly as possible. Despite this hiccup, I expect the preparations for the solstice tomorrow night go as planned. Of course, Phoenix said, smiling a little again. His Grace will be pleased with the festivities, I'm certain. Very good, Roger said. I won't detain you any longer then. I'll meet you for the regular exchange of reports tonight. Phoenix bowed again, and Roger bowed back, a little stiffly. Gods, but he was glad to see the back of him. What an immense bother! He would have to assign someone to keep Phoenix from meddling around the inner sanctum too much. Roger turned back towards the hall, and paused, because there was someone waiting for him. He smiled briefly. Ah, good. Priestess Tenjoin, he said. Just the person I needed to see. Have you been waiting for me? The woman inclined her head. Not long, Your Excellency, she said. Unlike Phoenix, Asuka Tenjoin was a bit harder to read. She had only entered the fold a few months ago in the outer sanctum, but she had a very particular streak of intensity that made Roger want to keep an eye on her. If she truly was the kind of person he took her to be, he would want her moved to the inner sanctum immediately. She rose from her bow as he waved her off, her braided blonde hair shifting over her back. She had a faintly tanned skin tone and almost glassy hazel eyes that hid her true expression most of the time. But Roger hadn't missed the way she glared at Phoenix's back when Phoenix wasn't looking, and if she held as much contempt for the man as Roger did, she could prove more than useful. Are you busy at the moment, Priestess Tenjoin? I need someone to inform the Emperor that I wish to see him. Tenjoin bowed her head again. At once, sir, she said. She turned and strode away, leaving Roger briefly alone. He thought for a moment then that he didn't know what she had been waiting for. Had she simply been eavesdropping? Well, he didn't necessarily discourage that skill in those he chose to bring into his inner circle. Still, he'd have to keep an eye on her. He began to walk, making his way down the long corridors of the temple until he reached the inner door. It opened with a touch from his fingers, the iron portal swinging wide to let him through. Several inner priests were already waiting in the inner corridor. It was dark, thin, and lined only with a few tiny torches. They waited for him to pass between them before falling into step behind him, all the way down the tunnel to the stairs. It grew dark and cold the farther down they went, Roger finally feeling a sense of calm come over him for the first time today. The cold of the inner chambers were relaxing in that regard. The stairs opened up to the chamber below, and Roger stepped through. The room was enormous, so large that it seemed impossible that it could fit underneath the temple. The ceiling was so far that the torches couldn't reach it, sending it into a looming darkness. Below, the chamber was shaped much like a cup. A raised dais ran around the room, with circular stairs leading down into the lower hollow below. The ground there was carved with long, curving symbols hewn deep into the floor like empty rivers. They were something of a maze across the floor, but each one led to one of 4 sizable circles carved into the floor, as though for containing water flowing through the grooves. All of the carved paths led up to the stone slab in the very center of the chamber. which was carved from the sides and across the top with similar designs, slightly sloped on both ends. Manacles were hammered into place at each corner, one dangling off the side. The other priests moved about the raised dais, going into the alcoves along the sides to withdraw the items that needed to be infused with power today. The current supply of demon weapons had been depleted from the rebellion, and there were other tools that needed to be blessed. Freshly smithed black blades and iron bangles for storing magical energy were pulled free and each added to one of the depressed circles in the floor. Roger himself walked down to the stone slab, inspecting it briefly to make sure it didn't need any additional maintenance. It had recently been cleaned, and the manacles were still firmly attached. He heard feet on the stairs and turned to see that the boy of the hour was here. The Emperor looked down at the floor, his face drawn and pale. Behind him, Roger's servant Dennis stood stiff, also looking at the floor. What a pathetic child. If he wasn't so obedient, Roger would have gotten rid of him for being so soft-hearted. "Don't just stand there," Roger snapped. "You know how this works." The boy flinched, tongue flicking out over his lips. Oh, but this was so much better than having to pretend to bow and scrape to him in public. The boy fumbled as he undid the ties of his robes. Dennis had to step forward and help him, tugging the fabric off his shoulders so that he was only in his leggings and bare feet. A priest on the dais stepped forward to grab him by the shoulder, hauling him down the stairs into the slab. Dennis ducked down to retrieve the robe, standing back up to look down at the boy's back, pale-faced. "Get back to his chambers, boy," Roger said. "You're not necessary here." Dennis looked sick, but he bowed and turned around, disappearing back up the stairs. The priest dragged the boy over to Roger. Roger considered him briefly. Scars ran the entire length of his torso, carved in curved, purposeful designs. But they were starting to fade, even though they had only been applied last week. His healing factor was incredible. Even blood runes meant to last decades, and purposefully scarred didn't last for long. No wonder he had been so expressive this morning. The runes that kept him obedient had been fading. Roger grabbed him by the hair wordlessly, hauling him up onto the slab. The boy didn't struggle, but there were tears in the corners of his eyes as Roger forced him to lie back, wrenching his arms up and locking them into the manacles over his head, and then repeating with his ankles. The other priests took up their positions around the room. Already the room was getting heavy with the smoky scent of demon magic as the ritual began. Roger retrieved the blade from his belt, twisting it briefly between his hands. A demon weapon, like the others, forged with black steel and infused with the magic inherent in the demon's blood. They were running low on supplies of late. It was a good thing the boy never died, no matter how much he bled. The boy gasped as Roger cut into his skin, blood immediately welling to the mark. Tears bubbled up over his eyes as he tried desperately to clench down on his jaw, trying not to scream. The blood welled up from the scar, dripping onto the table and into the ruts, starting to make its slow way through the cut designs until it would reach the pools where the weapons waited to be infused. The priest chanted in the background, old words that would hurry the blood and spark it with power. The boy screamed at the fourth cut, his face going white with how badly he was trying to stop. Roger almost considered gagging him again so he wouldn't have to hear it, but they were in too deep now. Besides, maybe he wanted the boy to scream after how much trouble he had put him through today. "You're barely worth the trouble it takes to keep you in line," Roger hissed at him, quietly enough so that the chanting would cover most of it up. "Perhaps you need to start spending more nights in the pit if you don't start cooperating." The boy flinched, screaming again with the next cut. I'm sorry," he gasped. I'm sorry. I'll be good, I promise." Blood poured from his wounds, filling up the grooves in the floor. It would take only about 15 minutes or so to finish the last of his runes so that Roger could control him again. But he'd have to keep reopening them for the next few hours so that they'd get enough blood before his wounds sealed up. It was just business, of course, Roger thought with another drag of his knife, but it was remarkably stress-relieving.